My name is Glenn Bryson. I'm 76 years old, and for the past 4 decades I've lived in the same house just outside a small town in Ohio. I built it with my own 2 hands the summer after my wife and I got married. Back then, it was just a patch of land and a pile of lumber, but I was full of dreams and determination. I taught history at the local high school, and every evening after work I'd come out here and build, hammering, measuring, sanding, imagining what our life would look like within these walls. Eventually, it became a home, filled with the smells of cooking, the sound of laughter, the clatter of holiday dinners, and the rustle of children running up and down the stairs. Now, it's quiet. Too quiet. The echoes are still there, but the people are gone. My wife, Nora, passed away 6 years ago. Cancer. She was the only person who truly saw me, who knew how to calm me when I grew tense, who brought color to everything. After she died, the house changed. It's hard to explain, but it lost its warmth. I still keep her books in the hallway shelf, her robe hanging behind the bathroom door, and her knitting basket untouched beside the living room couch. I talk to her sometimes, not aloud, just in my mind, especially in the early mornings when the light filters through the curtains the way she liked. I make coffee the way she used to like it, even though I never drink more than a few sips. It's more about the ritual than the taste. My daughter Margaret visits occasionally, or rather, she used to. Lately, her visits have become increasingly rare, short, and formal, often accompanied by her husband, Charles, a man I never quite trusted, but tried to tolerate for Nora's sake. Margaret was always my bright girl, curious and clever, the kind of child who asked too many questions in class and brought home stray animals. I loved her with all the awkward tenderness of a man raised to show strength but who found himself helpless in the face of a child's innocence. As she grew older, she changed. Or perhaps I changed. Or perhaps we both did. Either way, something shifted between us, subtly at first, then all at once. She became distant, efficient, polite, but cold. After Nora's funeral, she said we should start talking about transitions, about simplifying my life, reducing risk, considering professional help at home. She meant well, at least I tried to believe she did, but there was something about the way she said risk that stayed with me. I've never had the problems managing on my own. I do my own shopping, I pay my bills, I tend the garden, and even mow the lawn, though I admit it takes me longer now. My knees aren't what they used to be, but my mind is clear. I read constantly, history books, newspapers, biographies. I still do crossword puzzles every Sunday, and I rarely make a mistake. I'm not senile. I'm not losing touch. But lately, I've begun to wonder whether my clarity matters to anyone, because people are treating me like I'm fading. It began subtly. One neighbor, Mrs. Hanley, stopped waving. Then the cashier at the pharmacy asked if I needed help remembering my PIN. Then, one afternoon, I saw Margaret in the driveway, talking to our neighbor Kevin. They didn't see me watching through the upstairs window. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Margaret kept shaking her head and gesturing toward the house. Kevin nodded solemnly, like he was being told about someone who had started leaving the stove on or wandering at night. A few days later, I overheard the mailman whispering to someone at the edge of the lawn, "Yeah, it's real sad. He's not all there anymore." That phrase, "not all there," as if I were already gone. I didn't confront Margaret about it at first. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I'd misread the conversation. Maybe the mailman was talking about someone else. Maybe the problem was me, becoming suspicious, bitter. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I began noticing things. Calls that went unanswered, plans that were made without consulting me, sudden decisions presented as already finalized. Charles came by one weekend with a clipboard, said he was doing a safety check on the house. Fire alarms, gas lines, the works. He said it was standard. I told him I've been maintaining this house longer than he's been alive. He laughed and said, "No offense, Glenn, But your generation doesn't always know when it's time to pass the torch. I haven't spoken to him since. What hurts the most isn't the disrespect. I can handle that. What cuts deeper is the growing sense that they're preparing for something. A shift, a move, a transfer of control. They act like it's for my own good, but I can feel it in my bones. They're talking about me in past tense. Margaret started calling more often, but the conversations were always short and filled with leading questions. "Do you remember what day it is, Dad? Did you take your pills today? You sounded confused last week. Are you sleeping enough?" Then came the pamphlets. Brochures from assisted living centers, memory clinics, elder care lawyers. I threw them all away. But the seed had been planted. One morning, a man showed up at my door with a clipboard and a smile. He said he was a wellness consultant from the county office, here to conduct a standard cognitive wellness interview. I asked who sent him. He said my family had expressed concern. I told him I was perfectly fine, and that if he didn't leave my porch in 10 seconds, I'd call the police. He left, but not without a few notes scribbled down as he walked away. A few days later, I got a letter from the county office saying they were initiating an assessment of my mental competence and safety. That word, competence, leapt off the page like a slap. I sat in the kitchen that night staring at that letter, holding it like it might burn me. I remembered Nora's voice. "If they ever start talking about putting you away, Glenn, don't let them. Don't let them do to you what they did to your father." My father had died in a home. Not because he was mad, but because his second wife wanted the house. My mother had died in her own bed, with her hand in mine. That's how I wanted to go. But now, I wasn't sure I'd have the chance. So, this is where I am. A 76-year-old man in a house full of memories, watching as his own family begins to question his sanity, whisper to his neighbors, call the county behind his back. They say it's out of concern, but it doesn't feel like concern. It feels like betrayal, and it smells like preparation. For a legal maneuver, for a medical determination, for a forced transition. They think I'm soft, that I'll go along quietly, that I'll sign the papers and let them take what's mine. But they've underestimated me, because while they've been talking about me behind closed doors, I've been taking notes, watching, recording, preparing. They think I've lost my mind, but I know exactly what they're doing. And I'm going to make damn sure the judge knows it too. It was a Wednesday morning in early September when the doorbell rang. Not a casual knock, not a neighbor's tap, but a long, deliberate ring that echoed through the hallway like an alarm. I had just sat down with my coffee, the papers still unopened beside me. I remember the way the light slanted through the curtains, the stillness of the house, the sound of the clock ticking above the mantel. I opened the door to find two people standing on the porch, a woman in a beige blazer holding a folder and a younger man wearing khakis and a county-issued badge clipped to his belt. They introduced themselves as representatives from Adult Protective Services. The woman's name was Carol, and the man, I don't remember anymore. He didn't say much. Carol did most of the talking, her voice soft, practiced, almost maternal in a way that immediately put me on edge. She said there had been a formal concern raised regarding my welfare. She emphasized that they were here only to check in, just a quick wellness assessment. I asked her who had filed the report. She said the information was confidential, but that the report had come from a close family member. I didn't need her to name names. I knew exactly who it was. My daughter, Margaret, or more precisely, Margaret and her husband, Charles, the duo who had been tightening their grip on my life ever since Nora passed. I invited them in, not because I wanted to, but because refusing would only confirm whatever lies had been told about me. I watched their eyes scan the room as they stepped inside, cataloging my surroundings like crime scene investigators. The house was clean. My bed was made. The dishes were washed. But still I could feel their gaze weighing every detail. Was the floor slippery? Were there pill bottles on the table? Was the TV too loud? We sat in the living room. Carol opened her folder and began asking questions. Was I eating regularly? Did I have trouble remembering dates? Did I sometimes get lost or confused? Did I ever feel scared in my own home? The questions were carefully worded. Not accusations, but invitations to admit weakness. I answered each one with slow, deliberate calm. Yes, I cook my own meals. No, I don't forget where I am. No, I don't feel afraid in my home. I explained that I still read the newspaper every day, that I managed my own finances, that I had no trouble navigating the grocery store or keeping my medications in order. Carol smiled politely and took notes. The young man remained mostly silent, nodding occasionally, his eyes darting between me and her clipboard. Then Carol shifted in her seat and said, "We're just here to ensure your safety, Mr. Bryson." Sometimes people reach an age where they need more support than they realize. It's not about ability, it's about dignity and comfort. That word again, dignity. As if I had already lost it. As if inviting strangers into my home to question my sanity was a kind of compassion. I told her I appreciated the concern, but that I was fully capable of taking care of myself. I offered to show her my bills, my pill organizer, my appointment calendar. She declined, saying that this was only an initial visit, but that depending on what they found, further steps might be necessary. That's when the chill set in. Further steps. Before leaving, she handed me a pamphlet, the same one Margaret had left on my kitchen table 2 months prior, a guide to local assisted living options. "Just for your reference," she said, slipping it onto the end table like a calling card. They left shortly after, thanking me for my time and promising to follow up. I stood in the doorway watching them walk to their car, my hand still clutching the edge of the doorframe as if it might collapse under me. That evening, I called Margaret. She didn't pick up. I called again. No answer. I left a message. "I had visitors today. You know who sent them. You and I need to talk. Immediately." She didn't call back that night. The next morning, I received a voicemail. She sounded cheerful, almost overly so. "Hi, Dad. Just got your message. Sorry I've been swamped with work. What's this about visitors? Oh, if you mean Carol from APS, yes, I asked her to stop by. I just worry about you. You've seemed off lately, forgetting things. We just want what's best for you. Call me later." That fake lightness in her tone, like she was talking to a child who'd misplaced his slippers, made my blood boil. I didn't call back. Instead, I went to the local courthouse and requested copies of any open petitions or filings under my name. I had a sinking suspicion that this wasn't just a wellness check. The clerk pulled up my name and found a document filed 2 days earlier, a petition for temporary guardianship. The petitioner's name? Margaret H. Bennett, my daughter. The document claimed that I had shown signs of cognitive decline, had failed to maintain a safe living environment, and had expressed paranoid delusions. I stared at the words. Numb. Delusions. Unsafe. Decline. Every line was a lie, a weapon dressed as a concern. According to the petition, Margaret had requested that Charles be named as temporary guardian, pending a court evaluation. My daughter and her husband weren't just trying to help. They were trying to take over. When I got home, I didn't eat. I didn't turn on the TV. I sat in my chair, staring at the photograph on the mantel. Nora in her favorite summer dress, her smile forever caught in soft light. I imagined what she would say if she were here. "Don't let them do this, Glenn," she'd whisper. "You still have fight left in you." And I did. My mind may have aged, but it hadn't softened. I knew I needed help, so I called the one person I could still trust, Robert Morgan, a former student of mine turned attorney. He had sent me Christmas cards for years and always told me to call if I ever needed legal advice. He picked up on the second ring, and within 20 minutes we had a plan. The first step was securing a proper medical evaluation from a real doctor, not one handpicked by Margaret and Charles. I booked an appointment with Dr. Elaine Foster, a neurologist at the local hospital, who agreed to run a full cognitive panel. I passed every test. My memory, reflexes, attention span, all normal for my age. Dr. Foster even wrote a letter stating that, in her professional opinion, I was fully capable of managing my affairs and making independent decisions. Robert added this to our defense package and began building a timeline of events. The pamphlets, the manipulative phone calls, the sudden wellness visits. He requested access to my bank records and found something even more alarming. Multiple attempts by Charles to access my financial information through joint authorization requests. They'd been preparing for this for months. But the most damning piece came from my security camera. Months ago, I had installed a small motion-activated camera above the garage, mostly to keep an eye on raccoons and delivery packages. I never thought I'd use it for something like this. One of the accusations in Margaret's petition was that I had left the stove on and nearly caused a fire, a fabricated story to demonstrate cognitive impairment. But the footage from 2 weeks earlier showed Charles entering my house with a spare key while I was out for groceries. He went into the kitchen, turned on the stove, and left it burning for over an hour before returning. It was all on tape. Proof that they weren't just misjudging me. They were setting me up. I sat at my desk and wrote everything down. Dates, conversations, suspicions. I began keeping a journal. Not as a diary, but as a record. Every call, every visit, every look from a neighbor. Because I knew where this was going. The petition had been filed, the judge would set a date, and when that day came, I'd be ready. I would walk into that courtroom with my head high and my facts in order. They thought they could paint me as a senile old man clinging to a memory. But they were wrong. I wasn't fading. I was fighting. And this fight had just begun. 2 weeks after the petition had been filed and I had begun working with Robert, the tension around me started to condense. Not like a storm breaking all at once, but like heavy fog slowly swallowing the landscape. I noticed it in the way my phone would ring, and when I answered there would be a pause, then a click. I noticed it in the sudden quietness from my neighbors. People who had known me for 30 years now crossing the street instead of waving from their porches. One morning, I stepped outside to collect the newspaper and found that someone had taped a flyer to my front door. Do you know a senior at risk? It was from a local outreach group, the kind that partners with Adult Protective Services. At first, I thought it might have been a mistake, but then I saw that the flyer was addressed to whom it may concern at 144 Winterberry Road, my address. It wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate, and it felt like a warning disguised as outreach. I took it down and folded it neatly into my growing folder of evidence. I didn't get angry, not in the way you'd expect. I got quieter, more watchful. That's what they didn't understand. They thought I would rage or cry, but instead I did what I had done my whole life. I studied the patterns, I wrote them down, and I prepared. 3 days later, the sheriff came to my door. A real uniform this time, not a clipboard and a smile. He was polite but firm, and he handed me a formal court summons. The guardianship hearing had been scheduled. October 12th, 10 a.m., County Family Court. I was to appear before the judge and respond to the claims made by Margaret and Charles Bennett. The document included a summary of the claims, and reading them felt like stepping into a distorted mirror. Vaguely recognizable details warped into a grotesque image. According to the petition, I had become increasingly erratic, exhibited signs of paranoia, frequently forgot appointments, and had been witnessed wandering the neighborhood confused. I read that line twice, blinking, wandering. I walk to the corner store once a week and greet every clerk by name. I've never once been lost in my own neighborhood. But facts didn't seem to matter anymore. It was all about framing, perception, narrative. And in that narrative, I was being quietly erased. I went to the hardware store that afternoon and purchased a new set of locks. I replaced every one on the doors and windows by sundown, sweating in the early autumn heat, not because I feared a break-in from strangers, but because I feared access from the people I once called family. Charles still had a key. I remembered him asking for it a year ago, just in case something happened. Back then, I thought it was a gesture of concern. Now I saw it for what it really was: reconnaissance. That evening, I disconnected the landline and bought a prepaid cell phone. I didn't tell anyone the number, not even Robert, until we met the next day. I told him about the sheriff, about the flyer, about the neighbors going silent. He nodded, taking notes, always calm. That was Robert's strength. No drama, just clarity. He said we had a strong defense, especially with the medical letter and the video footage, but that we'd need more than proof. What they're counting on, he said, is that the court will lean toward safety, toward caution. You don't have to be declared incompetent, Glenn. All they need is to raise enough doubt. But if we can show this isn't about concern, it's about control, then we've got a real shot. The next escalation came from a direction I hadn't expected. My bank. I had gone in to check my account balances, just routine, and was told that access had been flagged for review. When I asked why, the teller, a young man named Thomas who knew me by name, said it was due to a family-initiated alert, suggesting that there may be unauthorized activity on the account. I stood there stunned, trying to remain composed as he pulled up the records. The alert had been placed by Charles Bennett 3 days earlier. He had claimed in a written statement that I had expressed confusion about recent withdrawals and requested that the bank freeze large transactions pending a review. I asked to speak with the branch manager. Eleanor, a woman in her 50s who'd been with the bank for decades, came out and ushered me into her office. When I explained what was happening, her face fell. "Mr. Bryson, I'm so sorry. We have to act on these alerts. But if you'd like to file a counterstatement and formally revoke third-party access, we can begin the process today." I signed the papers immediately. Eleanor promised to expedite the removal of any shared privileges and restore my full access. "It happens more often than you'd think," she said, almost whispering. "Families trying to take control too soon, or too forcefully." I thanked her and left, my hands trembling slightly as I walked back to the car. It wasn't the inconvenience. It was the realization that Charles was moving faster than I had thought, that they were trying to build a case not just of confusion, but of financial mismanagement. They wanted me to look not just old, but dangerous to myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with only the hallway light on, reading through the court documents highlighting the most egregious lies. Then I flipped through the letters Nora had written me over the years. Birthday cards, notes left on the fridge, scribbled lists with hearts at the bottom. They reminded me who I was. They reminded me that my life had value. And as I sat there, a knock came at the door. Soft, tentative, but insistent. I froze. It was nearly midnight. I approached the door quietly and looked through the peephole. It was Kevin, the neighbor who had stopped waving, the one I'd seen speaking to Margaret. I opened the door cautiously. "I shouldn't be here," he said, "but I need to tell you something." I let him in. He looked nervous, holding a manila envelope in his hand. He sat on the edge of the couch, avoiding my eyes. "I overheard something," he said. "A few weeks ago, your daughter and her husband, they were talking in my backyard, thought no one could hear them. They said you'd be taken care of before the year was out, that the court would side with them if they pushed the right buttons. That if they got guardianship, they'd have access to everything. Your house, your pension, your insurance. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to think maybe I misunderstood. But then I saw the sheriff's car here and—" He trailed off, then handed me the envelope. Inside was a printout, a screenshot from a neighborhood message board, a post from Charles under a pseudonym asking for recommendations on nursing homes that deal with dementia and stubborn elderly patients. The post was dated 2 weeks before the guardianship petition was filed. They had planned it all. I looked at Kevin and nodded. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. He stood to leave. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." "You said it now. That's what matters." After he left, I added the screenshot to my folder. The case wasn't just about me proving I was sane. It was about proving they were lying. The hearing was coming, and the noose was tightening. But I wasn't going to hang quietly. They had built a narrative. I was building a counter-narrative. The truth. And the truth had teeth. The morning of the hearing arrived draped in silence, the kind that wraps around you like fog and makes even your own breathing feel like a disruption. I dressed slowly, choosing the navy suit Nora had once called the respectable one, the one I wore to every parent-teacher conference and later to her funeral. I brushed the lapels twice, even though there was no dust, and polished my shoes, more out of habit than concern for appearance. I was preparing for something sacred, not a battle exactly, but a reckoning. The courthouse was a low brick building with a flag that hung motionless in the windless autumn air. Robert met me at the steps, his briefcase already open, the manila folder with our case neatly arranged inside. His calmness didn't waver, but I could tell by the stiffness of his jaw that he knew this was more than procedural. This was personal. Inside, the courtroom was quiet, almost sterile. Pale walls, wooden benches, and a scattering of people. At the far end sat the judge, a woman named Cynthia Delaney, known in the county for her firm, no-nonsense demeanor. She had a reputation for favoring caution in guardianship cases, for leaning toward safety over risk. I wasn't sure if that made her an ally or an obstacle. Margaret and Charles sat across the aisle side by side, dressed for grief, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced worry. Margaret looked at me, then quickly away, as if I were already a ghost. Charles didn't look at me at all. The proceedings began with formality, the recitation of names, the purpose of the hearing, the reading of the petition. I listened without blinking as the court clerk read aloud from the statements my daughter had submitted. They sounded like eulogies written by someone trying to keep the estate. She claimed I had become disoriented in public, that I forgot conversations, that I lashed out at her when she tried to help. There was even a paragraph about me accusing the neighbors of conspiracy, which I knew referred to the moment I saw her whispering to Kevin across the driveway, the moment I finally realized what she was capable of. After the clerk finished, Margaret stood. Her voice was soft, trembling, perfectly calibrated for maximum sympathy. She said she loved her father, that this was the hardest decision she had ever made, that it wasn't about money or control, but about safety, about love. She recounted stories, small ones, about me forgetting to turn off the lights, about repeating the same anecdote twice at dinner, about a time she found me crying in the kitchen after Nora died. She made it all sound so tragic, so inevitable, the slow, sad unraveling of a once dignified man. And the courtroom, the judge, the clerk, even Robert, seemed to bend slightly under the emotional weight of her words. That was the moment I realized how dangerous she had become. Because she believed her own performance. Or worse, she didn't believe a word of it, but knew exactly how to make others believe it. Then it was my turn. Robert rose and introduced the independent medical evaluation. He laid out the timeline of events, from the surprise wellness check to the discovery of the guardianship petition. He handed over Dr. Foster's report, clearly stating that I was fully competent, mentally sound, and in no need of oversight. He presented the bank documents showing attempts by Charles to seize financial access without my knowledge. Then, in a steady voice, he requested to play a short video for the court. The judge allowed it. The footage from my security camera filled the screen. Charles, entering my home, turning on the stove, leaving, returning an hour later. The courtroom was dead silent. Charles stiffened. Margaret's face blanched. For the first time, the judge leaned forward. "Mr. Bryson," she said, "do you have anything to add?" I stood. My knees were stiff, but my voice was steady. I spoke not like a man defending himself, but like a man explaining a lesson, something I had done 1,000 times before in a classroom. I told the court I had lived in that house for 42 years. I built it. I maintained it. I cared for my wife until the day she died in the same bedroom we had painted together as newlyweds. I told them I still cooked my own meals, still paid my own bills, still remembered every name of every student I'd taught for over 3 decades. I told them about the day my daughter stopped visiting, the day she started calling only when she needed something. I told them how it feels when your child speaks of you as if you were already gone. Then I paused and looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I am not confused. I am not delusional. I am not fragile. I am angry. Not because my daughter wants to help me, but because she wants to replace me. She wants to rewrite me, and I won't allow that." The silence afterward felt electric. The judge cleared her throat, asked a few procedural questions, then adjourned the session, saying she would issue her ruling within a week. As we left the courtroom, I walked past Margaret without looking at her. She called out, "Dad," but I kept walking. There was nothing left to say. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat on the porch watching the stars, wondering what Nora would have thought of all this. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. But something had shifted. The worst was no longer ahead. It was behind me now, and from here on, everything would be about reclaiming what they had tried to take. My name, my dignity, and my life. The war had begun with whispers. But now, finally, my voice had been heard. The days following the hearing passed in a strange, drawn-out tension, like the air before a thunderstorm that never quite breaks. I kept waiting for the judge's decision, waking up each morning hoping that a letter or a call might arrive, something definitive to tell me whether I still owned my own life. But the days stretched on, each one thick with uncertainty, until finally a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox, its seal marked by the county court. I opened it in the kitchen, standing by the counter where Nora once used to make coffee in the mornings, and read the words slowly, my heart thudding harder with each line. The judge had ruled in my favor. The guardianship petition was denied. I had been found competent, fully in control of my faculties and decisions, and all attempts by Margaret and Charles to assume legal authority over my affairs had been formally dismissed. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel something close to relief, even victory. But that feeling quickly curdled into something sharper, because what should have ended the battle, a court ruling, a declaration of autonomy, did not stop them. If anything, it made them more dangerous. The day after I received the letter, I went into town to pick up some groceries, and when I returned, I found the garage door slightly ajar. That, in itself, might not have been strange. Sometimes the wind catches it if it hasn't latched properly, but this time I knew I had closed it, had even double-checked it when I left. Inside, nothing was stolen, but someone had been there. A few of the boxes stacked in the corner had been moved. My tool chest had been opened. And on the floor, near the back wall, I found a set of footprints I didn't recognize. Heavier, broader than mine. I installed a second camera that night, one that covered the rear of the property, and changed the locks again. Whatever they were planning, they hadn't accepted defeat. They were still watching, still probing for a weakness. 3 days later, Robert called me with a voice full of restrained anger. "They've filed a motion for reconsideration," he said. "They're trying to submit new evidence, claiming that since the hearing, you've exhibited further signs of decline. They've attached a letter from a new physician. Doctor. Harold Bloom, I didn't recognize the name." "He's not your doctor," Robert confirmed. "He's someone they brought in." The letter alleges memory lapses, erratic behavior, increasing isolation. My stomach clenched. "They're trying to relitigate the same case," Robert said. "It's desperate. But, depending on the judge's tolerance, we may be forced to respond." I asked if he thought they had any chance. He was silent for a moment. "Unlikely, but not impossible. It depends on how much sway they can create with this so-called new diagnosis. We'll need to discredit it. And quickly." I spent the next day gathering documents, calling Dr. Foster to reaffirm her statement, and drafting a sworn affidavit detailing my activities since the hearing. It felt absurd, like I was a criminal trying to prove my innocence after already being acquitted. But I did it. Because I understood now that they weren't just trying to protect themselves anymore. They were trying to break me, piece by piece, inch by inch, until I lost the will to resist. Then came the attack on the house. Not physical, but financial. I received a letter from the county tax office stating that a request had been submitted to reassess the property based on potential safety hazards, mold, foundation instability, fire risk. The complaint had been anonymous, but the timing was no coincidence. An inspector arrived 2 days later, polite but firm, and spent nearly 2 hours walking through the home, taking photos, asking questions. When he left, he told me that any required repairs would need to be addressed within 90 days, or the property might be deemed uninhabitable under county ordinance. I asked him plainly, "Did my daughter put you up to this?" He looked uncomfortable but didn't deny it. "Sir, I'm just following protocol." That night I sat in my living room, the court letter in one hand, the county notice in the other, and tried to make sense of what I was feeling. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't confusion. It was something deeper, more ancient, a kind of sorrow fused with rage. I had given Margaret everything. My love, my trust, my patience. I had built this house with my own hands and filled it with a life of meaning. And now, the person I had once carried in my arms was trying to strip it all away, not out of malice, but out of something colder. Entitlement. She believed it was hers already. My life, my legacy, my dignity. And Charles, always behind her, always nudging, always steering her toward the next legal loophole or financial opportunity. I knew his type. Calculated kindness. Smiles sharpened like knives. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the local library, sat at one of the old wooden desks, and began looking into property law. I learned more in one afternoon than I had in months of conversation with lawyers. I found a clause, obscure but real, about title partitions in joint ownership scenarios. It stated that in cases of prolonged legal dispute, one party may initiate a forced sale of the property if they can prove that cohabitation is untenable or that their share of the ownership is being obstructed. I brought it to Robert. He reviewed it, nodded slowly, and said, "If we wanted to, we could try it. It's aggressive, but it's legal." That's when the thought truly formed. If they wanted to take the house, maybe it was time to take it from them first. I asked Robert to begin drafting paperwork. Meanwhile, I contacted an appraiser, a woman named Lila Page, who came highly recommended, and scheduled a full evaluation of the property. When she arrived, she was brisk, efficient, and not the least bit fazed by the tension in the air. "People do this a lot," she said, "family property disputes. You wouldn't believe how often." She walked through every room, asked smart questions, complimented the craftsmanship, and told me quietly as she packed up her kit, "This place is worth more than they realize. If you sell, you'll be in a strong position." That was all I needed to hear. By the time Margaret and Charles received the notice of intent to sell, I had already moved half my belongings into storage. I knew what their reaction would be, and I wasn't wrong. The next morning, my phone, the prepaid one, rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered. Margaret, her voice was cold, brittle. "You're making a mistake," she said. "This is vindictive." I didn't argue. "You think you're punishing us, but you're just hurting yourself." I asked her if Charles was listening. She paused, then said, "Yes." "Good," I said. "Then hear me clearly. You started this. I'm just finishing it." She hung up. The legal battle that followed was tedious, exhausting, and full of procedural delays. They challenged the appraised value, disputed the paperwork, attempted to freeze the sale through emergency injunctions. But none of it stuck. Because the court had already ruled me competent, because I had proof, because I wasn't alone, and because I was no longer afraid to act. What began as a desperate defense had become, at last, an offense. I wasn't just holding on to my life anymore. I was reclaiming it. And I would not be denied. It was a gray November morning when I received the message that the final hearing had been scheduled, the culmination of months of back-and-forth filings, accusations, and counterclaims. The motion to force the sale of the house had moved through the court system faster than expected, largely because my case had already been established as credible, and the judge was the same one who had ruled against the guardianship. This time, I knew the courtroom well, knew the feel of its wooden benches and the way the light slanted through its high windows. I arrived early, dressed simply, and waited in the hallway where everything smelled of old paper and floor polish. Margaret and Charles entered 10 minutes before the hearing, looking tired, worn down by the weight of their own war. There was no attempt at warmth, no last-ditch effort at reconciliation, just the mechanical acknowledgement of people who had once shared a life and were now adversaries in the most bitter of legal contests. The hearing began without ceremony. The judge, firm as ever, reviewed the facts briskly, reminded both parties of the prior findings. My legal capacity, the legitimacy of my ownership, the timeline of events. Margaret's lawyer spoke first, trying to argue that the forced sale would cause undue hardship, and that my decision was driven by emotional volatility rather than practical necessity. She claimed that my move to initiate the sale was retaliation, a reaction to being challenged on his declining health, and not a reason to act. But there was no heat behind her words, just repetition. Everyone in that room already knew what had transpired. The evidence had been documented, the motives exposed, the boundaries crossed. Robert stood and delivered a clean, methodical summary of our position, that I had attempted every reasonable avenue to coexist with my co-owners, that I had been excluded from the property I had helped finance, that I had been the subject of false medical claims, and that the house had become not a home, but a legal and emotional trap. He submitted the final appraisal from Lila Page, showing the market value. He reiterated that I was entitled not just to dignity, but to financial justice, that co-ownership was untenable given the documented breakdown in familial trust. And, when he finished, the judge did something unexpected. She asked if I wanted to speak, not as a legal formality, but as a personal gesture. I stood, my hands steady, and looked across the courtroom at my daughter. "I built that house for a family," I said, "but it hasn't been one for a long time. I gave everything I had to that home and to the people inside it. When my wife died, I hoped, foolishly, that the rest of us might hold together. But instead, I was turned into an obligation, a liability, a target. This process, as painful as it's been, has reminded me that I still have agency, that I still know what's real. And what's real is this: I cannot continue to exist in the shadow of people who do not respect me, who see my life as something to be managed. I do not want revenge. I want closure." When I sat down, the room was silent. Even Margaret looked away. The judge nodded once, then issued her ruling. The house would be sold, with proceeds divided by legal ownership. 1/3 to me, 2/3 to them. They would have 30 days to vacate the premises or arrange a buyout under market value. If neither occurred, the property would be listed publicly. After the hearing, I didn't go home right away. I walked through the park where Nora and I used to spend weekends, sat on a bench and listened to the wind shuffle through the dying leaves. I thought I would feel triumph, but what I felt instead was clarity. Cold, clean, final. That night I opened a bottle of wine, the good kind Nora used to save for holidays, and I drank a single glass to mark the end of something not with celebration, but with ceremony. A week later, they made their final move, and it was as ugly as it was predictable. I received a cease and desist letter from their lawyer, threatening to sue for emotional distress, accusing me of waging a campaign of defamation and elder coercion. The letter claimed I had manipulated court processes, influenced neighbors to malign their reputation, and exhibited vengeful behavior unbecoming of a rational adult. I showed it to Robert, who scanned it and laughed for the first time in months. "It's hollow," he said. "They're flailing. They can't stop what's coming, so now they're trying to scare you." He was right. I didn't even bother replying. 2 days before the court-imposed deadline, Margaret called me. Her voice was unsteady, frayed. She didn't beg. She didn't apologize. She asked me one question. "Why are you doing this?" I told her the truth. "Because you stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as an asset. And now I'm reminding you that I was never yours to manage." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "You'll die alone." I answered, "I already have. You just never noticed." Then I hung up. The line stayed dead after that. 30 days later, the house was listed. Within a week, it had 3 offers. Within a month, it was under contract. And within 6 weeks, I had a check in hand and a new place of my own, smaller but brighter, quieter but lighter. I filled it only with the essentials: books, photos, Nora's shawl, and left the rest behind. What I took with me was not bitterness, not vengeance, but something sharper and more enduring. The knowledge that justice, when pursued patiently and without compromise, can still find its mark. The first morning in my new home, I woke before dawn, not from noise or nightmares, but from the unfamiliar silence. The windows were cracked just slightly, and the air that drifted in was cool and damp, the scent of soil and rain rising from the ground like a quiet resurrection. There were no ghosts in this place yet. No marks on the walls from Nora's hand, no lingering echoes of slammed doors or whispered threats. Just stillness and space. I brewed a pot of coffee, not out of habit, but to mark the beginning of something new. The kitchen was small, the counters unfamiliar, but the act itself felt grounding. I sat at the table with my cup, watching light gradually creep across the floor, and for the first time in years, I felt the presence of choice. Not the illusion of control, but the genuine, sturdy feeling that I was exactly where I chose to be. The town was different, smaller, even quieter than the one I had left, but people here didn't know my name, and that was a blessing. I went to the post office the second day and signed up for a new box. The clerk, a woman maybe in her 50s, asked how long I'd be staying. "Indefinitely," I said. I didn't give a forwarding address. Let Margaret and Charles wonder. Let them stew in the silence I left behind, in the hollow space where my presence used to be something they could leverage and twist. I wasn't interested in updates. I didn't want to know what they did with their third of the sale money, whether they paid down their debts or fought over it or squandered it. That story no longer belonged to me. I'd thought I might feel something like sadness, a kind of slow-burning regret. Not for what I'd done, but for how it had ended. But the truth was, the grief had already passed, long before the house was sold. It had come in waves over the years. When I first noticed Margaret avoiding my calls, when Charles began making decisions on my behalf, when the neighbors looked at me like I was a man unraveling. Those were the real endings. This was aftermath. And aftermath, however lonely, is a kind of freedom. There's a library in town, not large but with deep shelves and quiet corners. I go there twice a week. I read the papers, leaf through dusty hardcovers, sometimes sit by the front window and watch people pass. A teenage girl works the front desk, smart, curious, and one afternoon she asked me what I used to do. I told her I'd been a teacher. "History?" she asked. I nodded. "Want to help me sort the donation cart?" she offered, and I agreed. Now it's something we do together, an unspoken arrangement. She tells me about her classes. I tell her about the past, not as dusty timelines, but as real stories of real people who, like me, had to learn too late how fragile dignity can be. I started writing again. Not memoirs, nothing dramatic or bitter, but reflections, fragments, pieces of things I remember. I write them in longhand in a spiral-bound notebook Nora once bought for me on a whim, thinking I might try poetry someday. I never did, but now I write small truths. What it felt like to watch a daughter turn cold. The sound of a door closing with finality. The way betrayal isn't a single moment but a slow accumulation of neglect. I don't know if anyone will read it. I don't care. It's not for them. It's for me. A month after the move, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photo, one I hadn't seen in years, of Margaret as a child, sitting on my shoulders, her hair wild in the wind. No note, no signature. I studied the picture for a long time, then placed it in a drawer, not out of hatred, but because I finally understood something. Love doesn't always die in flames. Sometimes it just retreats, quietly, into the past, where it belongs. I don't know how many years I have left, but I know this. I will spend them on my own terms. I will plant tomatoes in the spring, drink coffee on the porch in silence, maybe write a letter to an old student. I will live small but true. And if the world forgets me, if I become just another quiet man in a quiet house at the edge of town, that's fine. Because I remember. I remember who I was, what I endured, and what I refused to surrender. Let that be enough. Let that be my final word.